You're watching Beyond Markets, where we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. Welcome, I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining me. On the show today, we'll explore ways to attract investors into Africa's future energy mix. And later on, the Director General of the Expo 2020 Dubai Bureau tells us what to expect and how ready Dubai is to host the world. As always, you can join the conversation on social media. Let me know what you think about the topics we discuss. And to do so, use the hashtag Beyond Markets, and on Twitter you can send me a message to my handle. It's at Esther O. Awoniyi. The CEO for General Electric's gas power business for Sub-Saharan Africa, Elisee Sezan, says as more Africans get better access to power, it could become a driver to unlock economic growth in the region. He also notes that there is an evolution to attract the right number of investors to drive growth in the power sector in Africa. I caught up with him to discuss this and more.
As you know, we've been in Sub-Saharan Africa for 120 years. And over the years, we've worked with our partners, government and also private, to actually add megawatt to the grid. What we are really passionate about is to make sure that as many people in Africa have access to electricity, so they get a better life, and it can actually be a driver for economic growth for the region. So in doing that, early on, customer used to be government because they were the one making investment in power plants. So for example, in Nigeria in 2005, we worked with the government that procure a lot of gas turbine from us to put power all across the region through the NIPP that we've worked over time to install those power plants. And with the evolution and the stretch in the budget of the government, we have more and more private customers where the government create the environment so that private investor can come in and make investment to bring power to the grid. Those are the IPPs.
Would you say we're seeing a good amount of that coming, the private investment?
Absolutely. This is transition in the sector, which is positive, which allows the government to use some of the budget in areas like education and health, and then create an environment where they can attract private investors. So for example, in Ivory Coast, we'll be going tomorrow. The oldest IPP private investor is more than 20 years old, CPRAL. Okay. Azito, that we're going to be visiting also tomorrow, has been operating more than 16 years old. And we have the same thing in Ghana. There's some private investor in Nigeria, like Transcorp, and all across the region. So we're seeing that transition. It's not perfect, there's more work to be done, but there's definitely an evolution in attracting the right number of investors to be able to drive growth in the power sector.
For those investors who are looking in, perhaps who haven't played yet in the African market and are just looking in from the eyes outside and looking at those guys who are here already, are there entry barriers for them? And for those who are here, those barriers that they had to overcome, could you talk to us about that?
The way we think about it, I think the first thing in any investment, you have to take the time and learn. And it's very difficult to learn if you're not on the ground. So we really believe in localization. We have about 400 people in our gas power business. In Africa, 95% of them are local. All of our business, all over the country are run by local people that are qualified, educated around the world, but have the passion of driving growth here. So my number one advice, make the investment to come on the ground to understand how things works. It's not perfect. This is a hard business, but if you do it right, there's definitely a lot of value for investor. And this is just the beginning of the IPP market in Africa.
You know, some analysts that I've spoken to say they're concerned about the sustainability or the fact that we may not see, because as you said, African budgets, annual budgets, sure, these are stretched. There are competing needs, across sectors, and of course, much needed private sector cash, capital needs to come in. But sustainability, how long that flow will continue to come in, raises questions. And its power, obviously, it's an opportunity. At the same time, it's a challenge. Are investors looking beyond the challenges? Like you said, they have to come in and they have to be on the ground. But some may not want to do that. But do you see a good number of them looking beyond those challenges and at the opportunities?
So what we've seen from our experience is that our government are also have more experience in creating an environment where the investor can play. Okay. So if you look at the value chain of the power sector, it starts with what field do you have. If you have gas, more and more government are taking the step to understand how do we put together a gas plan, gas framework to take that risk away from investor. Because if an investor has to take a gas risk on top of power generation, is more complicated. So that's first one. And then on the other side, transmission, distribution, and make sure you can collect whatever you sell. So for example, in Nigeria, there's been a huge initiative last year to install meters in people's houses so you can collect power. TCN made significant investment for transmission lines. So when you start now tackling some of those parts of the value chain, then an investor can come in and focus on power generation, because I know that the fuel piece is covered, my transmission and distribution, my collection. And we're seeing that Ivory Coast is a good example that I've figured out. More and more countries like Ghana are doing the same thing, and even Nigeria is taking a step to do that. It's not easy, but it's definitely improving. The good thing about it is every single day we have people approaching us in GE that want to play in the power sector in Africa, which is the good news.
That's certainly good news. certainly good news. But I'd like to hear your perspective also on the renewable conversation. Speaking to your colleague earlier, talking about how despite the momentum we're seeing with clean energy, solar and the rest of it, and the off-grid solutions, especially for the rural areas where governments feel like perhaps they can spend less money, but at the same time use clean energy. But that's not the entire part of the story. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about your own perspective on this and how gas still plays a key role.
My perspective is renewable is here today and is here to stay. So when we look at the market in the next 10 years, the fastest growing part of the energy market is renewable. So that's a fact. At the same time, whether you put a solar solution or you put a wind solution, everybody knows that those solutions are not available 100% of the time. So depending on what application you want to do, wind will work in certain circumstances, solar will work. Like I have some solar panel in my house, and that works very well. But when we talk about where a continent needs to do a leapfrog in an industrialization area to create jobs for the hundreds of millions of Africans that graduate from school every single year, you cannot do that without dependable, available, and affordable power. So my personal belief and GE's belief is we can go to that evolution in Africa without gas. And we can see an example of that in South Africa that is significant install base today. They just passed the RRP, which in the next 10 to 15 years, they're gonna reduce significantly the coal, which is a good thing. And as part of that, they're gonna replace it with renewable, but the base also, gas is gonna play a good role. So we think renewable is here today. Our solution complement renewable, but gas is gonna keep growing in Africa while we transition to renewable. So I'm excited about it.
Okay, from a regulation standpoint now across the markets that GE plays in, what are your expectations? What are you looking out for in terms of regulation in the spaces here?
So I think step one in the transition, I think all of the government understand that they don't have the funding to invest in power infrastructure by themselves. That's step one. So if you look at every study, they estimated that for Africa to get about 70% electrification rate, we need to invest $14 billion every year between now and 2040. No government have that type of budget. So that's, for us, is the starting point. The second piece, what we're starting to see also across the board is government are starting to learn from each other, meaning they are part of the ecosystem that they need to attract investors, whether it's on gas, investor, IPPs, banks, developers, they cannot solve it alone. They need to build an ecosystem. And part of the ecosystem, they can facilitate by putting the right framework around fuel, whether it's gas, liquid, they have to own that. And then take step into the distribution and transmission so that people today, like you and I, have the belief that we're gonna get reliable power. Because once we believe it, we are ready now to pay for it. Once you get to that point and you have people okay and believing to pay, then you create a system that works. But you cannot do that in one day, even in 1 year. So you're gonna have some gaps at the beginning between what it costs to produce your power and actually what the people pay. And over time, you can have mechanism in place to kind of reduce the gap until you have a cost-reflective tariff at some point.
Talk to us about, for this year also, GE's, your focus, your investments, what's new and what can we look forward to?
So we've been here for 120 years and we're here to stay. We're excited about Africa. And for me personally, and then for the people that are part of the team, this is a mission to wake up every day and say we'll contribute to make sure people have electricity and drive the continent. So we have a long-term play. Today, there's a lot of countries we've been. Nigeria is an important country for us. Ghana, Ivory Coast, Angola. So we're still gonna be there. And number one, support the customers that have GE machine on the ground. Because the number one thing is to make sure when I make an investment for 20 years, every single day, the machine is available and deliver power on the grid. That's number one for us. And do that safely and do that with quality. I think that's step one. Second, we're also working with new countries that are discovering gas. So Senegal, for example, they have discovered gas. Mozambique have just discovered gas. South Africa going through a transition from coal to renewable to gas. So we're actually supporting the countries, helping them to think through solution, what we can bring from a technology standpoint, but overall solution with some of our partners to kind of help them in the path of monetizing the gas and then generating electricity for the countries.